Well, welcome once again to the Doctor of Digital podcast. And my special guest today is Noah Healy. So you can't believe the background of Noah. So that's why I wanted to get him on the show. He's a professional algorithm developer. So I know, what is that? And a recreational mathematician. So that sounds very interesting as well. He's also has a background in game theory. He designs marketplaces. He does a lot of really interesting things. So naturally, on the Doctor of Digital podcast, the only podcast that has to do with CEOs and business leaders who want to grow their show using social audio. And definitely, we got to know more about algorithms, and that's why I wanted Noah on the show. Also want to welcome JJJM Advertising. They've got a great article, Why Quality Over Quantity is the Key to Effective Content. And if you want to sponsor an episode of the Doctor of Digital podcast, get a hold of me. Also, feel free to join the Burning America community, where people here collect interested in the things that we're talking about on the podcast. So with that as an introduction, Noah, thanks for coming on the show today. I appreciate that you spent some time with us today. Can you tell us a little bit about all these things? What the heck is a professional algorithm developer and a recreational mathematician? I just can't wait to hear your answer.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for having me here. And well, they're fairly similar. It's sort of vocation and avocation, whether you're getting paid or just doing it for fun. But algorithms sit at the heart of the use of computers, and we've become used to, I think, mainly because of Steve Jobs, of thinking of computers as some sort of appliance that's sort of this television, radio station, game, thing or something like that. But
Yeah.
at its core, computers are a mathematical tool that was developed to be able to create new kinds of proofs and learn new kinds of approaches to solving problems. And it is those approaches to solving problems that are algorithms. And specifically, it's ways of solving problems which can be, and this term goes back to the 19th century, mechanized. So we are used to thinking of the physical and mental spheres as being somewhat separate from one another. What happened in the 1930s was a mathematician proved that, in fact, there was a link, and that link was any device that could be called a computer. And a computer was a machine that could become any machine that you could tell it about. And so that's what algorithms are. Algorithms are descriptions of machines that can be consumed by a computer to allow computers to become the machine that you're describing.
Now, I find this really fascinating for all kinds of reasons. So I have a background in history, and I really appreciate you going back a little bit and telling people, because I think you're right in saying we see these things as sort of an appliance, but the way you're describing a computer is actually something very different and much more accurate. So it's really important for us to understand, and the audience to understand this. Since you did make some allusions to the background and Steve Jobs and what have you, what are some of the changes that you have seen in the field in algorithms? Because people do notice that when changes take place on Google, for example, they go, well, why did this completely change my search capability? So could you talk a little bit about the changes that you've seen take place?
Yeah, sure. So probably the biggest change, the kind of thing you're talking about there, is that the word algorithm has entered into the popular consciousness, not sadly in a particularly good way, because it's become this term that means some sort of shadowy, underbelly, sort of like the subconscious of the internet, as it were, and that it's this thing that's manipulating you or changing things in ways that you don't understand, which might be beneficial to you and might be harmful, and you can't even tell the difference between those two things. I think actually that's where I see the primary axis of change. Computers are entering into our common lexicon and common life, and what we've seen is that the institutions, businesses, governments, just social institutions, dating, all evolved in a time before that was true. And now that we have this completely new technology that is at the core, this kind of magic spell of, I can just tell this thing to be something and it will be that thing.
Mhm.
Our systems aren't robust to this capacity. And so where the reason I think that algorithm has become this sort of dark word to conjure with is that uh, we're seeing the systems that we rely on decay because they're being algorithmized in ways that are very detrimental to broader society.
Mhm. With that being said, are there some areas that you can point to so that people can grasp this and understand? In other words, are there some areas that we would say are growth areas for us to understand, both in terms of the technology, but then also how the general public can understand what is happening with algorithms?
Yeah, I think that's fairly easy to do because it's, again, it's a part of our common life. A company like Amazon is fairly similar to a company like Sears from a century ago. They're basically, doing remote sales of retail product. Um, on the other hand, the reason Sears is, gone at this point, and Amazon is one of the most important companies in the world, according to the stock exchange, is that the Willis Tower, the former Sears Tower, was built as a essentially gigantic computer in a
Mhm.
time when you could only use human beings to carry out those, you
Mhm.
know, uh, uh, clerk style work. Amazon can get all that stuff done in a few ounces of silicon, basically. And so that cost reduction, if Amazon was doing the kinds of business volume that it currently does, but using the kinds of a century plus ago technology, they would need to have multiple Pentagons full of people, and they wouldn't be able to stay in business. Um, Decades ago, Walmart became one of the biggest consumers of supercomputer time in order to handle its pricing strategies. Uh, so these things allow us to take action in totally new ways. Now, the next step, now that we've sort of gotten this capacity, is whether or not we're using this capacity in ways that are then helpful. And we can see, again, in very large companies, things like, say, Facebook, where whether or not you're gaining from Facebook, or it's what's known as a red queen's race, where the
Mhm.
competition just sort of stalemates against each other. And so the more you put into it, the more other people have to put into it, um, is very questionable. And that's because Facebook doesn't have a underlying system of determination of social good that it's producing. And so instead, it's this relatively amorphous system of social transmission, which we have evolved ways to do, that take a lot of advantage of the fact that people could really only talk to other people who were physically next to them in speeds that were, consonant with uh, talking with one another. But now that Facebook exists, or Twitter, the bot nets can exist, and suddenly a single individual can communicate with effectively everybody through hundreds of voices simultaneously. And that really changes the quality of the conversations that occur on platforms like that.
Mhm. So I appreciate that you're referring to some specific examples of companies, and let's say we have business owners, because that's what people are really listening to for the podcast. So if you're the business owner and you're not necessarily Amazon or the big mogul type like a Facebook or whatever, what would you recommend business owners to think about when they are considering these aspects of algorithms, and how can I effectively portray my products and services online? And what would I do if I were a business owner? What kind of suggestions would you make for them?
I have this system I call the story matrix, and it's really about trying to work out how you fit into the broader context. The the reliance on immediate term returns, I think, is a little short-sighted, because we exist in a world where there's a lot of moving parts and a lot of things that are clearly unsustainable, that are underpinning things. And so if you are relying on those things and then suddenly a market crash causes them to go away,
Hmm.
or a supply chain disruption, then suddenly you've gotten yourself in a lot of trouble. And so what you what you should be doing is working out the game theoretic strategic structure
Oh.
of the situation that you're engaged in. And what that means is working out the participants in your system. So yourself, your customers, your clients, your employees, however that's structured, um, and thinking through the question of what they're interested in and what's being provided to them by your service. And what you're looking for is situations where there's a competitive advantage and a cooperative surplus being generated. Because if you don't have both of those things, if you don't have a competitive advantage, then other businesses will be able to muscle you out of the system. And if you do not have a cooperative advantage being produced, a cooperative surplus being produced,
Hmm.
then ultimately what you're doing is harmful. And again, uh, that's not a sustainable way to be operating a system.
Mhm. So if you're a business owner, and that's who really is listening to the podcast. So I'm a business owner and I'm interested in what you're saying, and I find that this is appealing. What sort of expertise do you offer, and how is it that you assist businesses and people who would like to benefit from your knowledge and what you do?
So what I do is I can walk through the inputs to the story matrix. I can do the mathematics that underlie that, and develop what I call a negotiation game structure, if that's appropriate.
Mm.
And a negotiation game is essentially a computer program that you can add to a system to allow its participants to negotiate better outcomes, not merely for themselves, but also for the system. And so if you're in a good place, you can reach a point where your clients or customers are actually helping to improve the way that you're operating, or what you're providing, and that can be incredibly valuable.
Yeah, I think you just nailed it there. That's the game theory. So that's where you're taking the theory and marrying it to the practical and the technical side of the computer.
Yes, yeah. One really amazing possibility with the negotiation game is that you can actually reach the point where your competitors are also helping you operate better, and so it's at that point it becomes somewhat like professional sporting leagues where
Yeah.
competition is what they're selling, and so competitive imbalance is actually something of a negative for them at that point, because if the same team wins every year by the same amount, it's just boring and nobody wants to watch anymore. So you can find structures where uh, competitors can take advantage of the fact that they're all doing more or less the same thing to share information that will help them out in general with what they're doing. And you can reverse some of these red queen's race situations where you're not all wasting money on something that isn't really gaining you anything competitively.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating, and it's a wide range of subjects we actually covered, but it's very succinct and very clear in having this discussion, I think. So it's really been helpful to understand how algorithms work and how it, particularly how it can apply to business and competition. So that's pretty awesome that I've been able to cover all this in really a short amount of time. Now, if a person was interested in what you're doing, because I know I'm fascinated by it, I'm sure there's other people as well, how would they get a hold of you, and what would you recommend if they would like to contact you and follow up on this?
Well, the easiest way to get in touch with me is through my email. I'm at noahphealy@yahoo.com. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm Noah Healy there. And I've got a website called Coordisc that discusses the application of my ideas to financial markets. And I've been working on that for the better part of a decade now.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Noah, for coming on the show today. I really appreciate this. It's been a very deep subject, but covered very well and succinctly. So I appreciate you taking out some time, and I certainly learned a lot, and hopefully the audience did as well. Thanks for being my guest today.
Thank you for having me here. This was a lot of fun.
All right. Thank you so much. So this is the Dr. Digital podcast. And don't forget, I've got a great sponsor, JJM Advertising. They've got a good article out there, Why Quality Over Quantity is the Key to Effective Content. If you want to be a sponsor, contact me and get a hold of me at mick.smith@wsiworld.com. And also, until next time, make sure you join the Burning America community and other things we talk about related to the podcast. Take care until next time. This is the Dr. Digital podcast signing off. Deus Volt.